All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today, we're tackling a demon, a pretty infamous one, actually.
Oh, going straight to hell, are we?
You could say that. We're looking at Asmodeus, and our main source is this fascinating piece from mythology.net.
Asmodeus, huh? He's quite a character.
That's an understatement. This demon has looks that could kill, a personality that's had a serious makeover over the centuries, and, get this, a link to gambling.
Now, that's intriguing. I'm always fascinated by how these figures evolve, how they reflect changing ideas about temptation and sin.
It's like they're a mirror to society's anxieties.
Exactly.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. Who is Asmodeus?
Well, according to our source, he's demon royalty, one of the 7 princes of hell, not just some run-of-the-mill imp.
Oh no, this guy's got some serious underworld clout.
He does. And his main domain, you ask, primarily lust. But we're not talking about simple temptation here. We're talking influence that's brought down kings.
Kings, really?
Even ensnared figures like Bathsheba, King Solomon's wife.
Wow, that's some serious power.
It is.
And just to add another layer of intrigue, Asmodeus is also linked to Lilith.
Oh, Lilith. She's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Agreed. We'll have to save her for another time. But for now, let's stick with Asmodeus and get to the visual. What did this demon actually look like?
Well, if you were hoping for devilishly handsome, the older texts might disappoint you. Imagine, if you can, a 3-headed monstrosity.
3 heads. Okay, now you've got my attention.
All right, picture this. You've got a sheep head, a bull head, and just for good measure, a man's head. But not a nice one.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to say that.
We're talking pointed ears, a hooked nose, teeth like daggers, and a mouth that breathes fire.
So less fallen angel and more straight out of a nightmare.
That's one way to put it.
I can see why this guy had a reputation.
He did. But, there is a more toned-down version of him in later myths.
Right, the source mentioned that. So did he get a makeover?
Sort of. In later depictions, Asmodeus becomes a handsome young man.
Okay, that's an improvement, right?
Maybe. But there's a catch. He has a limp and 1 rooster leg.
Wait, 1 rooster leg? You can't make this stuff up.
It seems they couldn't resist that one bizarre detail.
It's like they were trying to make him attractive, even seductive, but couldn't quite shake the whole demon thing.
That detail certainly makes him memorable.
I'll say, it's like, don't forget, folks, still a demon.
Exactly. It highlights how these figures can be both terrifying and kind of absurd.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the looks down, but what about personality? How did Asmodeus go from 3-headed terror to, whatever he became later on?
As you might expect, the initial portrayal is pretty straightforward. He's cunning, cruel, driven by lust and vengeance.
Makes sense.
There's even a story about him tormenting a woman named Sarah, killing off all her potential husbands.
7 of them, according to the source. Poor Sarah. I can't even imagine the fear, constantly pursued by suitors, only to have them meet such awful ends.
It paints Asmodeus as a force of pure malice, doesn't it?
It does, but I thought you said he became more playful later on.
Yes, that's where things get interesting. In some later depictions, he still embodies temptation, especially promiscuity and gambling. But he loses that outright cruelty.
So, less tormenting innocent women, more, partying and rolling the dice?
Basically. He becomes more mischievous, even lighthearted in some interpretations.
Wow, that must is quite a shift. Maybe it was a way for people to cope with their own temptations without being completely terrified.
Perhaps. It might have made those vices a little less scary, a little more human.
I like that. It's a good point. It suggests that how we view figures like Asmodeus might reflect our own anxieties and, our desires.
Right. But to really understand this evolution, we need to go back to his origins. Mythology.net traces Asmodeus all the way back to a Persian demon, Ashmediva.
So we're talking about a figure who crosses cultures and religions, like a game of mythological telephone, changing a bit with each retelling.
Exactly. But some things stay consistent, like his link to temptation and his knack for causing chaos.
Oh, yes, chaos. Speaking of which, there's that great story from the Talmud and the Testament of Solomon, where Asmodeus outsmarts King Solomon himself.
Oh yes, that's a classic.
Wait, outsmarts King Solomon, the guy known for his wisdom.
Even the wisest can be tricked, it seems. Asmodeus, apparently quite smitten with Solomon's wives, hurls Solomon 400 miles into the desert.
400 miles! Ouch!
Then he disguises himself as the king and takes over the palace. Wives included, of course.
Talk about adding insult to injury. Poor Solomon, exiled to the desert while a demon's living it up in his palace.
It is rather comical.
It is. But it also shows a level of cunning that goes beyond brute force. Makes you wonder if this story was a cautionary tale, or maybe even a bit of humor, poking fun at even the most esteemed figures.
It certainly adds complexity to his character.
Yeah.
He's not just some mindless beast. He's a strategic thinker who can outmaneuver the most powerful figures.
Yeah, definitely not your average demon. And this isn't just a one-off story either. He pops up in the Book of Tobit too, and guess what he's doing?
Tormenting Sarah by killing off her suitors.
Bingo. Poor Sarah really can't catch a break.
Seems not.
But it sounds like Asmodeus eventually gets what's coming to him, at least in these stories.
He does.
So how does he go from tormenting biblical figures to appearing in 17th century plays? That's quite a leap.
It is, isn't it? It's a question we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive. But let's just say that Asmodeus' story takes some unexpected turns. He ends up being classified and categorized within demonology. And yes, even makes it to those 17th century plays.
So less terrifying demon and more.
What? Mischievous spirit.
Think of him more like a meddling spirit, almost like a genie in a bottle.
A genie. That's a far cry from the three-headed monster we started with. Whatever happened to the Prince of Hell? It seems that as his story traveled through different cultures and traditions, those rough edges got smoothed out a bit. He went from pure evil to a more ambiguous, even entertaining character. Like how some old horror movies that scared people silly now seem, well, kind of campy.
So, demoted from Prince of Hell to mischievous spirit of temptation. Maybe some lighthearted troublemaking on the side?
You got it. And this shift, it becomes even more interesting when you consider those 17th century plays. You know, they were often comedies dealing with love, desire, social satire, that kind of thing. Asmodeus, with his connection to lust and meddling in human affairs, well, he fit right in.
Makes sense. It's almost like he became a way to explore those taboo subjects in a way that was both entertaining and, maybe a bit thought-provoking.
It's a great point. By making him less threatening, he could be used to examine those complex human desires and behaviors without alienating the audience.
Clever. So what caused this transformation? Why did he become less threatening, less demonic over time?
There are a few possible explanations. One is the evolution of storytelling itself. As these myths and legends get passed down through generations, they tend to change with the times, adapt to the tastes and sensibilities of the people telling them.
Like fashion trends. What was shocking or edgy becomes mainstream, even outdated.
Exactly. The same could be said for how we view figures like Asmodeus.
Interesting.
Another factor might be the changing religious landscape. You see, as Christianity became more widespread and the church solidified its doctrines, there may have been a tendency to, downplay the power of individual demons like Asmodeus.
So instead of these powerful, independent entities, demons became more like tools of Satan, right? Carrying out his will, but not really a direct threat to God's authority.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how these mythological figures are so malleable, reflecting the beliefs and anxieties of the cultures that shape their stories.
They really are. And Asmodeus is a prime example of that. He's been a monstrous demon, a cunning trickster, a mischievous spirit, even a comedic character. His story really highlights how fluid these figures can be, how they can be adapted and reinterpreted to fit different narratives and cultural contexts.
It shows how these stories can be so much more than just entertainment. They can give us a glimpse into how people thought and felt in different times and places.
Yeah.
So, why should we care about the story of a demon who's been both terrifying and, kind of silly over the centuries? What does it all mean for us today?
I think Asmodeus' story reminds us that even our most deeply ingrained beliefs and fears are subject to change. What might have terrified our ancestors might seem absurd to us, and vice versa.
It's a reminder that our view of the world, the stories we tell, even the figures we fear or revere, are all shaped by the cultural and historical forces around us.
That's a good way to put it. We're not so different from those who came before us. We're just grappling with different versions of the same questions, about temptation, morality, good and evil.
Exactly. It's like a conversation across time. Now, before we wrap up this part of the dive, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, Asmodeus' connection to gambling.
Ah, yes, his reputation for overseeing gambling dens. It seems like a bit of an odd pairing at first, doesn't it? Lust, we get, given his whole Prince of Hell background, but gambling.
It's not as obvious as the lust connection, that's for sure. Maybe it has something to do with temptation, taking risks, being consumed by vice.
That's a good point. Gambling, like lust, it can be addictive. It can lead to ruin. It preys on that desire for instant gratification, that willingness to risk everything for a chance at winning, even when the odds are stacked against you.
So Asmodeus, the master of temptation, he'd naturally be drawn to those places, right? To environments where people are willing to risk it all for a chance at pleasure or fortune. It's like he embodies that voice inside us, urging us to indulge even when we know we shouldn't.
I like that. And it's interesting to note that this association with gambling, it persists even in those later, more comedic portrayals of him.
So even when he loses some of his demonic edge, he keeps that link to the darker side of human behavior.
It seems so.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Is there a deeper meaning there? Something about the nature of temptation and how it can manifest in all these different forms.
Certainly something to think about. And it speaks to the complexity of these figures, how they're not always easy to categorize or understand. They can be both alluring and repulsive, terrifying and entertaining, all at the same time.
Asmodeus, the demon of lust, revenge, and apparently gambling, he really has defied easy categorization, hasn't he? Evolving over time to reflect the changing cultural and religious landscape.
He has.
His story really reminds us that even the most deeply held beliefs can change, and that the figures we fear or revere are often shaped by the stories we tell about them.
Absolutely.
So as we conclude this part of our deep dive, we're left with a few lingering questions. What happens to figures like Asmodeus in our increasingly secular world? Will they fade away, or will they find new life in contemporary stories and interpretations?
And what does Asmodeus's connection to temptation in all its forms tell us about that ongoing struggle between our desires and, well, our better angels?
Those are questions we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive. Be sure to join us as we go even deeper into the world of Asmodeus and the enduring power of myth.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Asmodeus. Last time, we were left with a bit of a cliffhanger. How did Asmodeus, the terrifying three-headed demon, end up in 17th century plays?
Well, so many figures from folklore and mythology, they've been adapted and reshaped over time. It's not really surprising that Asmodeus is no exception. His evolution, it really reflects how cultural and religious beliefs have changed around him.
So how did he make it to the stage? What kind of role did he play?
Instead of this horrifying demon, picture him more like a mischievous spirit, almost like a genie, trapped in a bottle.
A genie? That's a big difference from the demon who tormented Sarah and tricked King Solomon.
It is a shift, isn't it? He was often depicted as comedic, granting wishes, causing a little chaos here and there. But he'd lost that real sense of malice that we saw in the earlier stories.
So, no more Prince of Hell, just a mischievous spirit of temptation, a bit of playful troublemaking. Exactly.
Yeah.
And this shift, it's really interesting when you think about the context of those 17th century plays. They were often comedies, right? Dealing with love, desire, or social satire. Asmodeus, with his connection to lust and his tendency to meddle in human affairs, well, he fit right in.
It's like they used him to explore those taboo subjects in a way that was fun but also made you think.
That's a good point. They made him less threatening, so he could be used to examine these complicated human desires and behaviors without, turning the audience off completely.
So why the transformation? Why did he become less scary, less demonic over time?
Well, there are a few possible explanations. One is simply the way storytelling evolves. Those myths and legends passed down through generations, they change to fit the times. They adapt to the tastes and sensibilities of the people who are telling them.
It's like fashion, right? What was once shocking or edgy eventually becomes mainstream, even outdated.
Exactly. And the same thing happens with how we see figures like Asmodeus.
That makes sense.
Another factor might be, think about the changing religious landscape. As Christianity spread and the church solidified its doctrines, there might have been a tendency to downplay the power of individual demons.
So it's less about these powerful independent demons and more about them being tools of Satan. They're carrying out his will, but not really a direct threat to God.
Right.
It's amazing how these mythological figures can change so much,
Yeah.
reflecting the anxieties and beliefs of the cultures that shape their stories.
It's true. Asmodeus is a perfect example of that. He's been a monster, a trickster, a mischievous spirit, even a comedic character. His story really shows how fluid these figures can be, how they can be adapted and reinterpreted to fit different narratives and different cultural contexts.
So why should we care about a demon who's been both terrifying and, kind of silly? What does it all mean for us today?
I think his story reminds us that even our deepest beliefs and fears, they can change. What scared our ancestors might seem absurd to us, and who knows, maybe what we fear now will seem ridiculous to people in the future.
It's a good point. It reminds us that the way we see the world, the stories we tell, even who we fear, it's all shaped by our culture and history.
We're not that different from the people who came before us. We're all just Well, dealing with different versions of the same questions, you know, questions about temptation, morality, good and evil.
Exactly. It's like we're having this conversation across time. Okay, before we wrap up this part of the dive, let's go back to something we talked about before. Remember Asmodeus and his connection to gambling?
Oh yeah, that whole thing about him overseeing gambling dens, it does seem a bit strange at first, doesn't it? Lust, sure, we get that, with his whole Prince of Hell thing, but gambling.
It's not as obvious as the lust connection, that's for sure. Maybe it's about temptation, about taking risks, being consumed by vice.
You know, gambling, just like lust, it can be addictive, it can ruin people's lives. It plays on that need for instant gratification, that willingness to risk everything for a chance to win, even when you know you probably won't.
So, Asmodeus, the master of temptation, he'd be drawn to those places where people are willing to risk it all, right? For pleasure, fortune, whatever it is, it's like he's that voice in our heads urging us to indulge, even when we know we probably shouldn't.
I like that. And it's interesting how that connection to gambling sticks around, even in those later, more comedic portrayals of him.
So even when he's not so scary anymore, he still has that link to the darker side of human nature.
It seems that way.
It makes you wonder if there's a deeper meaning there, something about temptation itself and how it shows up in all these different ways.
That's a good question. And it really speaks to how complex these figures are. They're not always easy to put into neat little boxes, you know? They can be attractive and repulsive, terrifying and funny, sometimes all at the same time.
Asmodeus, the demon of lust, revenge, and, well, gambling, he really has defied easy categorization, evolving over time.
He has.
His story reminds us that even our most deeply held beliefs are subject to change, and that the figures we fear or revere are often shaped by the stories we tell about them.
Absolutely.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we're left with some interesting questions. What will happen to figures like Asmodeus in our increasingly secular world? Do they fade away, or find new life in modern stories?
And what does Asmodeus' connection to temptation in all its forms tell us about that constant struggle between our desires and, well, trying to be good?
These are questions we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive, so be sure to join us as we go even deeper into the world of Asmodeus and the lasting power of myth. Welcome back, deep divers. We're wrapping up our look at Asmodeus, and I gotta say, this demon has taken us on quite a ride. From three-headed monster to mischievous genie, it seems like he's always changing things up.
He really shows how powerful stories can be, how they change and adapt over time. Asmodeus' journey through mythology really highlights how our fears, desires, even our sense of humor, have all evolved.
And speaking of evolution, remember that connection to gambling we talked about? Well, it takes on a whole new meaning when you think about Asmodeus in pop culture today, especially games like Dungeons & Dragons.
Oh, that's a great point. Asmodeus is pretty popular in D&D, and it's interesting how they portray him. Often he's still an antagonist, but there's this, well, wit about him. A sense of cunning, even dark humor, that makes him more than just a villain.
Right. He's like this charismatic bad boy of the underworld, the guy who embodies temptation but with a certain style. I think it speaks to why he's stayed such a compelling figure, you know? He's not just evil, he's complex. He reflects those darker parts of us.
Exactly. Asmodeus embodies those desires, those impulses we might not want to admit to. The lust for power, the thrill of risk, the temptation to overindulge.
So what can we learn from Asmodeus' transformation? From terrifying demon to, well, a more relatable figure. What does it say about how we view these ancient stories today?
I think his story shows us the power of storytelling itself. How the stories we tell shape how we see the world, how we fit into it. We're always looking back at these old myths and legends, reinterpreting them to fit our own views.
It's like we're having a conversation with the past, taking these ancient figures and asking what you mean to us now.
Exactly. And as we learn more, as our world changes, so do those stories. It's a back and forth, you know. Keeps them alive, keeps them relevant.
So Asmodeus' journey, it mirrors our own in a way, our own changing understanding of good and evil, temptation, redemption. He represents those inner demons we all wrestle with, but he also reminds us that they can change, be reinterpreted, even embraced.
It's about confronting those demons, acknowledging the temptations, the complexities that make us human. Maybe that's how we become more self-aware, more understanding of the world.
Well said. It seems Asmodeus, even though he's a demon, has taught us quite a bit about ourselves, about storytelling, about the power of myth.
And who knows, maybe there's a bit of Asmodeus in all of us. That spark of mischief, that touch of cunning, that willingness to push the boundaries a little.
Now there's a thought. So listeners, as you go about your day, keep Asmodeus in mind. He might just inspire you to embrace your own inner trickster, question your assumptions, and find those hidden meanings in the stories that shape our lives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge and wonder.